Very much, Mr. Chairman. And it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship. I want to congratulate the member for Glasgow South West for securing this debate. I'm sure there will be a lot I go on to say that he'll agree with. Public sector pay has been obviously a hot topic for parties across the political divide over the past few years. The 1% rate pay cap in the public sector was introduced in 2010 by the coalition government, and it was seen at the time as a reasonable approach to help reduce the deficit while keeping pay increases in line with what was at the time very low rates of inflation. This formed part of the government's long-term economic plan and helped get this country's public finances back under control, helped ensure that finances and the public sector got running back onto a more sustainable footing. And as we've seen recently with some of the deficit costs coming down and some of the targets being met by the government, you've seen some of that effort and some of that sacrifice has actually borne fruit in more recent months and years. It has allowed the UK government to protect public sector jobs and services, and it has been a very necessary process. And that is why, I believe, the SNP administration in Scotland and the Labour administration in Wales also implemented the 1% pay cap policy. However, as I'm sure members across the Hall will agree, it was never intended to be permanent or even a long-term solution. That is why I'm pleased that the UK government is moving away from the 1% public sector pay policy in favour of a more flexible approach. It is only more than fair that this shift in pay policy comes now. But the policy, and as one of my honourable friends mentioned, it did help to address some of the issues that were emerging between private and public sector pay, whereas as a result of the Great Recession, we saw a decrease in private sector pay that wasn't reflected as severely in public sector pay. And so what we have seen since then was a divergence and now more of a convergence. I will give way.
I think I'm giving way. It's a really interesting point there. And also, isn't this situation described, in fact, exacerbated by pensions differences? The fact is that the pensions of public sector workers are far more valuable than those in the private sector.
I thank my honourable friend for his contribution. I think that's right, and I think we need to look at pay, but we also need to look at overall packages as well. They include pensions, they include other rights and responsibilities that both public and private sector employees benefit from. But I want to be really clear, the public sector should always be as competitive and as attractive as the private sector in both pay and package. I'm certainly not making the argument here that there should be any decrease in that. I will give way, yeah.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He appears to be outlining a case for the end for public sector pay restraint. Could he advise the Chamber what he feels the government could be doing to ensure that departments are able to fund the pay rises that my honourable friend talked about, such as the Treasury actually investing in the departments doing so?
I thank the honourable member for his contribution. Yes, that is the point I'm making. I think as part of the delegated pay reviews, the recommendations will be forthcoming. The NHS, and I'll come on to it shortly, but some of the NHS pay increases that were put forward have been funded, and I'm sure the Minister will go on to talk about further funding details shortly. Yes, I will give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I'm sympathetic to the points that he's raised, and congratulate the honourable member for bringing this debate today. But on that point of the pay review bodies, it's been the case the pay review bodies have had their hands tied by the government historically at that 1% pay cap. So do we think it's time actually the government should listen to those independent pay review bodies and implement the meaningful increases that are recommended by those pay review bodies, given that they have regard to recruitment and retention issues throughout the public sector, but particularly in the sectors that they recommend on?
I thank my honourable friend. I'm wary, as obviously I am a backbencher, not a government minister, to commit to the government. But yes, I mean, the point that I'm making here is that where we have recommendations of pay increases, I think the government should fund them. I think it's only fair that after a period of, where people having to make sacrifices and we've had to have more financial control, now with inflation increasing, we should make sure we have sustainable pay increases across the different departments and sectors within public life to reflect some of the increases that are in private life, in the private sector too. So as real wages increase across the United Kingdom, much like the economy as a whole, I'm glad that some of the hard-working public sector staff are reaping some of the benefits of the UK's new, more flexible approach that has been introduced. So the pay rises in the NHS in England of between 6.5% and 29% over the next 3 years, for example, I think is great progress. And I welcome the fact that pay increases will be larger for lower paid staff and smaller for those on the highest salaries. And this is versus, as the Right Honourable Member for Glasgow South West mentioned, 3% plus 1% in Scotland. And I think we should be really clear in this chamber, because I think sometimes in Scottish issues we don't get the full story. And so I think what's really important is we are speaking in favour of some of the pay increases, but what's been clear is in the NHS in England, the pay increase has been 6.5% and 29%, and in Scotland, it's been 3% plus 1%, as the Honourable Member has actually voiced and given here today. So I think we all face challenges. We all face challenges. I just wish the SNP would be more honest in the challenges that we face here. I will let you in. Let me just complete this point, and I will let you in. It is right that these pay increases have been directed more towards those who are just about managing and those on lower incomes, and it should benefit those who really need a pay rise. I note that the devolved administration has mirrored the UK government's 1% pay policy when it was in place, and I'm glad that now public sector workers in Scotland will also be receiving some increases, although I do hope they will be as generous as the ones afforded by the UK government. I will give way to Senator.
Does he accept that the pay differential between the NHS in England and the NHS in Scotland is 1% in favour of the Scottish employees?
I think we've got to go. I'll be very careful making generalisations, because if you go on the kind of case by case, especially on some of the lower income workers, that 1% differential doesn't apply. But I'd be more than happy to talk with him in detail elsewhere and go on to the level by level detail. However, I would say that obviously we're talking about pay. The other side of this equation is, of course, tax. And I am very disappointed that the SNP administration in Edinburgh has decided to increase income tax in Scotland. So anyone earning over £26,000 is now called a so-called high earner, having to pay more income tax than their English and Welsh counterparts. Now, £26,000 is just about the average wage in the United Kingdom, just slightly lower. That includes teachers, that includes nurses, that includes doctors, that includes armed forces. And I think the armed forces is an incredibly important point, because armed forces personnel stationed in Scotland now pay more than any other armed forces personnel in the world. So, in fact, Scotland is now the only place where armed forces personnel will pay more tax than any other station in the British Armed Forces around the world. It is... I'm sorry. I will correct... I'll let you come in, but I will come back. Yeah.
I'm sure the Honourable Member will understand and appreciate that armed forces terms and conditions allow them to ensure that there is an even playing field between different areas of deployment, which means that if there are spikes and drops in terms of taxation or any other cost to their employment, that they do not have to suffer that themselves. So they will get the pay rise, but they will not have to suffer the increase in the tax rises.
Apologies, they will not get it. Yeah, sorry.
From bench, he has protected time, and I would ask him to be a bit more disciplined and allow backbenchers to have their time as well. Mr. Grimm.
Thank you very much, Mr. Owen. I always welcome a lively debate with my other colleagues. I think, to be clear, no, that pay rise won't come from the devolved administration that imposed the tax. It will come from the UK government, who have to cough up to bridge the gap. And it's not me who said this, that Scotland is the highest raised tax for armed forces personnel. It was General Nugee at a hearing of the Public Accounts Committee just yesterday. So that is fact. It is clear, and it will be left down to HMT to try and bridge the gap and make sure people aren't disadvantaged. Scotland was already the most taxed part of the United Kingdom. Forces, as I said, nurses, teachers and other public sector staff to pay, at least in their part, for some of the pay rises that they've been then given. So on one hand, it's been given in a pay rise, but then taken with more tax. And that's at a time when Scotland badly needs to attract more public sector workers to deal with the horrendous staffing shortages in the NHS and in schools. Shortages that have developed over the last 10 years, and I believe that obviously the UK government and the devolved administration should do as much as possible. And I just make one more point about tax, because I know it's a lively conversation across the chamber, and will be and should be continued debate over this Parliament, is that the tax increases that have taken place in Scotland they only deliver 38 pence more for the lowest income per week. So that's for the lowest income earners, for what is meant to be a progressive move, only gives them 38 pence more per week. It's not progressive, it's pathetic. It just shows the contrast between the UK administration and the SNP administration in Edinburgh, that the SNP don't have a grip on our public services in this day and age, and that plenty of people in Scotland are being disadvantaged as a result. The UK government has shown that it's possible, through a strong economy, to give public sector workers a sustainable pay rise without them having to pay for it through increased taxes. I will take that, sir.
Well, I thank the honourable member for giving me. Can I bring him back to reality? The UK government, each and every UK government department has budgeted for civil service pay a pay rise of 1%. The Scottish Government is taking a different approach. So does he not acknowledge that the public sector pay cap in reality is still in place when it comes to employees who work for the UK government?
I thank the honourable member. I won't speak for the Minister, so I'm sure we'll come to this, but the pay rises that we've seen of 6.5% plus in NHS are being fully funded. I'm sure as the other pay review bodies come through, they will fund them too. I'm sorry, I'm just finishing up. The Minister, I'm sure the Minister will come back. I'm sure the Minister will come back on this. But the simple point is that public pay sector they do deserve a pay rise. It should be one that is sustainable, but it should be one that we constantly review. I 100% agree with the government's more flexible approach, and I think we should maintain those public sector pay rises and always ensure that public sector roles, especially as the government goes into more challenging circumstances and we try and be truly global Britain, we need to make sure that public sector pay and the packages that surround them are just as attractive and just as rewarding as every private sector role, no matter where they are in the United Kingdom.